So the focus is very much on how to make monitoring a common and a lasting practice, or at least contribute to that, with experiences from these three countries in Latin America, El Salvador, Honduras and Paraguay. And just to start with the key messages that came out of this work, and we will elaborate it further on in the presentation. What really triggered the focus on monitoring in Latin America is the focus on improving sustainability. It was very much conceptualized in the three countries that monitoring should provide information to target post-construction support to service providers to better know what the problems with sustainability are, so better support can be provided. So we need to see monitoring in this context of sustainability. However, various of the monitoring systems that had been developed in the region before have suffered sustainability problems. They were not updated regularly, or they were only used once, or didn't cover the entire country. Therefore, in this work, the focus very much on identifying what are some of the risks for sustainability of the monitoring systems themselves, and how can these be mitigated. And in order to do so, this presentation will show a structured approach for defining the institutional arrangements for monitoring, so that it's clear who is responsible for every step in the monitoring system. And this was done in a multi-stakeholder process led by government. And when I talk about institutional arrangements, that does very explicitly include the costing of these arrangements. What is a bit of the background to this work? A couple of years ago, the Inter-American Development Bank re-entered the rural wash sector after having focused for various years more on urban areas. And when they re-entered the wash sector, the rural wash sector, they were quite shocked, because they found that many of the systems they had supported before were no longer functioning, or they were providing a lower level of service than expected. And even in many of the countries where they worked, they couldn't even find information on how rural wash was doing. Very few up-to-date inventories, very little data on what was actually happening. And that triggered their interest, together also with support from the Spanish Development Corporation, to really support various countries in the region in developing monitoring systems of the sustainability of rural water supplies. With the 2 points in mind, 2 objectives in mind. One, targeting the post-construction support, so that monitoring information could be used for providing such support, but also informing investment plan. Knowing what basically the asset inventory is can then be used for investment planning. And in all of this, a very crucial part would be to address the sustainability of the monitoring systems themselves. By having that clear institutional framework around them, and making an upfront costing and financial arrangements for how that monitoring would be financed in future. And this is where IRC came in. We had a dialogue with the Inter-American Development Bank and with the Spanish Development Corporation to collaborate on that, both on the development of the indicators that could be used for targeting post-construction support, as well as for developing the institutional framework and the costing around it. And that we applied then in 3 countries. The first of those countries that we started working in was Honduras. Honduras, as you may know from previous presentations, used to have a quite well-functioning rural water information system called CIAR. It was regularly updated by technicians who visited the water supply systems on a regular basis, let's say once a year, assess the status of the system, assess the status of the service provider, and then classify these on a scale from A to D, with A being performing very well and D being in dire straits. But some 4 or 5 years ago, this system started to get out of date quite quickly, because the one donor that had sponsored and supported all of this, USAID, withdrew from the sector, and the government didn't step in to take over the financing and the funding associated with that. 2 years ago, Honduras joined a regional monitoring initiative that was initially triggered by the government of Panama together with the World Bank, called CSR. The CSR, the monitoring system itself, is very similar to the old CR. It also used this classification system, but with some improvements, particularly the use of mobile phones and web-based interfaces for visualization. And this was being promoted in Panama, Nicaragua, and then Honduras very quickly joined in to make use of this new information system. But in that, so actually the change in information system was not a big step because the CSR is very much built on the previous CR. But in this, they really wanted to improve on the institutional arrangements around it, because it basically implied a move from an organizational monitoring system that was managed by the one government agency to a sector monitoring system. And a sector monitoring system meaning that the results of the work would be open to all sector stakeholders, from national government to municipalities. It would then also need to meet the needs of the different stakeholders. So the information to be compiled, and it would need to speak both to the regulator, to the planner, to the municipalities, or to the service providers. And that in itself implied then decentralizing and distributing the data collection. So making it much more complex, rather than a management by single organization, management by all the stakeholders in the sector. So what we did over the last year, go through each of the steps in the institutional, in the monitoring cycle, and develop for each of the steps in the monitoring cycle the specific institutional responsibilities, including flows of information. In addition, this entailed then an exercise of costing. How much would regular updating and using it cost? Some of the key issues that came up there that were hotly debated. The first one was around data collection. Previously, a centralized government agency used to do all the data collection. They had very well trained staff to do so. But under this more distributed monitoring system, this responsibility would need to move to municipalities and service providers, many of whom might not have the skills or the capacity for that. So there was quite a bit of discussion between the centralized agency and others over the speed with which this decentralization would need to happen, and all the checks and controls that would need to be in place to make sure that actually this would happen. There was also quite a bit of discussion around how to go about validation of data. And I think in the debates around it, some were very much in a kind of a control mode, saying, no, we need to do spot checks and we need to go and visit to see whether the enumerators are doing a good job. To others who said, well, let people just collect the data, make it available, and then it will be municipalities, service providers who can, through open access of information, check whether the data that is captured in the system is correct. And I think what in the end was said is that you need to start with some more of the spot checks, seeking out obvious errors to make the system work fine, but gradually need to move to validation just basically through the open access of information. Processing, this was supposed to be all automated, but already in the first couple of rounds we found that there are many bugs and mistakes in the algorithms to process all the data. So I think what we said, on what in any monitoring system you need is a very careful calibration of these algorithms to really sort out all the bugs. And I think what we have found so far, that actually the weakest link, and I think that echoes very well with what we saw at the monitoring symposium, is around analysis and interpretation. Lots of enthusiasm to go around with the tablets and the mobile phones to collect all the data, to make nice graphs, but then interpreting the data with the municipalities, with the other stakeholders. That has happened only to a limited extent, partially because of limited capacity at decentralized level, and partially because the national level is much more interested in compiling all the data at country level and then making overall national analysis rather than doing an analysis at the decentralized level. El Salvador is basically a country very centralized, also because it's relatively small. It has one national utility for all the urban areas, but community-based management in rural areas remains up to now unregulated. There's no formal policy community-based organizations have no formal status. It's all in a gray area. But over the last 2 years, this national utility has been tasked to also start providing and taking care better of the rural areas. And as part of that, the first wish was to get a better understanding of what is actually happening in the rural water supply sector. What is the status of the systems? What is the status of the services? So the initial interest was doing a first inventory of all the assets in the country, as well as the services that are being provided. So the work focused very much around indicator development, again, the service level, service provider performance, and access to support. And also using, similar to the other countries in Central America, using a series of algorithms to come to overall scores on that, on a scale from A to D, so as to make it also comparable to other countries. So I think that was maybe a bit more technical work around service levels and service level indicators, and that is now being used in the monitoring system, but still managed very much by the central utility, and not so much spread out as we have seen in Honduras or what is being done in Paraguay. But I think one of the key triggers in all of that, or the key things that it has triggered, is the need for post-construction support mechanism. Some of these mechanisms exist already there, particularly driven by civil society, but basically the comment in all this work was, okay, now we know what services are being provided, but where can communities now get support? So I think that will be an area of work in future, and I think it shows again how monitoring can help contributing to triggering work on post-construction support. So looking at the 3 countries now in hindsight, to summarize what we have done, some of the key elements of the approach have been, first of all, defining clearly what we define by a monitoring system. And in all this work, we have seen a monitoring system as a set of procedures for carrying out monitoring by very clearly mentioning the objectives. Is it for post-construction support, for planning, for asset inventory, describing the processes, the steps in all of in monitoring. Most of the work, I think, has gone into really detailing the institutional arrangements, who is responsible for what, particularly in the more distributed systems of monitoring. And of course also the information systems themselves, the technological platforms, the indicator sets, and so on. And then around that, the focus has been on critically assessing the capacity to use and maintain these monitoring systems, looking at the financial framework, the human resources to fulfill the responsibilities, the institutional ownership, the governance, and all of that, the cost of it. And another key element of the approach has, in all 3 countries, maybe with exception for El Salvador, has been a multi-stakeholder process, led by government, even though it was not always clear who is actually the lead government agency. Particularly, we have 2 or 3 big government agencies together. But yeah, led by government, but with involvement of different other stakeholders. The approach, I think this is also how we reconstructed it. I think we developed the approach as we went. In all cases, started by an analysis of the current monitoring practices, mapping current information flows, mapping the current institutional arrangement, identifying gaps in it. Then defining the monitoring system itself, the main components, the objectives, the processes, the tools, and the stakeholders. And then really going into the detail of defining the institutional arrangement, who is responsible for what. And then finally assessing the cost of monitoring, and then assessing whether the entities that have been assigned certain responsibilities actually have the financing to cover these costs. Some of the tools we use, and I won't go into much detail around that, we have made extensive use of all kinds of matrices to map current monitoring activities, mapping for each of the steps that you see here in the monitoring process, going from data collection to processing, analysis, to identifying corrective actions, done by, in this case in Honduras, by different stakeholders, by service providers, by water committees, by NGOs, mapping for each of them what they are already doing now to identify gaps and to identify overlap. We have also used other matrices to define future roles. Again, here a case from Honduras, mapping the key sector agencies and defining what their future roles would be. So this is, in a broad sense, defining the future roles and then doing that in more detail. This is another matrix used in El Salvador, where we have defined for each of the steps again in the monitoring process in more detail what each other's roles would be. And that was often done both for the first kind of inventory, because in all cases it was decided, you know, the first inventory that needs to be done quite rapidly by a decentralized agency who can then hire enumerators who can do a massive campaign, but over time that responsibility should then be decentralized. So we differentiated also different phases in the monitoring system. The final step was the costing and the responsibilities for financing. So that was done through detailed budgeting of all the steps in that, again differentiating between doing the baseline or the inventory and the regular monitoring, trying to quantify all the costs, including also the salaries of government staff, the time at the minimum salary of communities. In the case of Honduras, this was also verified through 2 rounds of piloting. And now I think we are at the stage of then defining what are the financial agreements, who should take care of which costs. And those are now some of the next steps that still need to be taken, check whether actually these costs can be met by the different bodies. Here are some of the figures, the results of the costing. Doing the baseline, it was in Honduras, there we have the actual figures was between 24 and 34 cents of a dollar. In El Salvador, based on the budgeting, not yet the real testing, it was 39. In Paraguay, it was only 9 cents of a dollar, but the scope of that was much more limited. And the estimates for the regular updating, so the ongoing monitoring, are 11 plus 8. The 8 is for the capacity building, so 19 cents of a dollar in El Salvador and 23 in Honduras. And I think what we also found in a further breakdown that, of course, the biggest costs are data collection, because that implies most travel, but there's also big costs involved in analysis and helping municipalities and communities to interpret the data from monitoring.
Steph?
What are some of the lessons learned from this?
Steph?
When you develop a monitoring system, it needs to be built on existing monitoring practices, even if these are incomplete or imperfect. So that's why that mapping of current practices was important. In all the cases, it appeared to be most feasible to decentralize most of the steps of monitoring to local government or service provider level, but that then implies also the need to have sufficient support to local governments to do this work. I think what Emma already mentioned, the need to have a gradual approach to the comprehensiveness of the scope of monitoring. So I think in all cases, starting with water supply and then moving to sanitation. Also what Emma also mentioned, to take a phased approach to reach countrywide scale. So start with some pilots, also to test the information system, create ownership within the sector, and then scaling up. And I think finally, costing is an important tool in assessing whether the institutional framework makes sense and what are some of the risks that some of the cost will not be covered. So I think that is the presentation for now.